Sophia adjusted the stiff collar of her uniform. When Mrs. Lillian stepped into the familiar restaurant, she sensed an unsettling change in the air. The cozy, inviting ambience she had cherished for years felt distant, as though the warmth had faded. The low murmur of conversations, the clinking of dishes, and the comforting aroma of freshly prepared food were still there, yet something was undeniably different. Normally the staff greeted her with friendly smiles, but today their gazes were cold, dismissive. Lillian's heart sank slightly. This place had been her haven, a spot for birthdays, anniversaries, and peaceful moments of solitude. Today, like those special times in the past, was meant to be memorable. It was her birthday. She would reserved a table just yesterday, following her usual routine, with the expectation of a quiet, pleasant celebration, but now the atmosphere felt strained. As her eyes wandered around the room, they landed on a new face, a young waiter, his demeanor unfamiliar and unwelcome. He glanced at her briefly, before returning to his notepad, his frown unmistakable. A flicker of unease crept over her, but she quickly brushed it off, attributing his coldness to perhaps a long, tiring shift with her characteristic grace. Mrs. Lillian approached the counter, her smile met only with indifference. "Hello," she said softly. "I have a reservation under the name Lillian." Her tone was calm, respectful. The waiter looked up, with a flicker of something she could not quite place. Irritation, maybe even disdain. It was not friendly, that much she knew. "There are no tables available," he replied flatly, without even bothering to check the reservation list. Lillian frowned, slightly surprised by his dismissive tone. "I called yesterday to confirm. Could you please check again?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. With a sigh he responded, his impatience barely concealed. "I said there are no tables available." He waved her off dismissively, his expression showing neither regret nor willingness to help. "You should try somewhere else." A knot formed in Lillian's chest, a familiar ache stirring memories she tried to forget. She had faced this kind of quiet dismissal before, this unspoken judgment, but not here. Not in a place that felt like an extension of her own home. Swallowing her hurt, she forced herself to stay composed. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice unwavering, but with a hint of disbelief. "I do not mind waiting until something opens up." The waiter barely glanced at her, crossing his arms with a slight smirk. "There is nothing for you here," he said coldly, a hint of malice in his tone. "You should leave." Lillian stood in stunned silence, the bitterness of his words sinking deep. There was something more beneath his demeanor, a disdain that spoke of something ugly and familiar. She could feel the weight of it pressing on her, threatening to make her shrink. The years of silent endurance, of brushing off thoughtless slights resurfaced, pulling her into that old, painful familiarity. But Lillian had long learned that dignity was not something others could grant or withhold. It was something she carried within herself. Straightening her posture, she placed her hands calmly on the counter, her voice soft but steady. "Perhaps you do not know who I am," she said, attempting to appeal to some sense of reason. Maybe he was just young and oblivious, she thought, not truly mean-spirited. But the waiter chuckled, shaking his head with a mocking smile. "I do not care who you are," he replied with a smirk. "There is no place for people like you here." The words struck like a blow, and for a moment the room seemed to close in around her. "People like you." She had heard it before, had felt it sting before, yet each time it hurt anew. To hear it here, in a place where she had so many warm memories, felt like a betrayal. Her gaze swept across the restaurant, noticing how others watched. Some diners quickly looked away when she met their eyes, while others continued to observe, their faces a mix of curiosity and discomfort. She would never been one to seek attention, but this was different. This moment was not about her reservation, or the cold treatment from a waiter. It was about every time someone had told her, directly or indirectly, that she did not belong. A deep breath steadied her, as memories of past encounters flashed through her mind. How often had she, in her quiet strength, held her head high in the face of judgment? How many times had she chosen grace over retaliation? Today, though her heart ached, Lillian reminded herself of one truth she held dear. Her worth was not defined by someone else's opinion, and she would not be diminished by their disregard. With quiet dignity, she met the waiter's gaze one last time, hoping to convey her resilience, her unyielding pride in who she was. Then, with a soft but resolute good evening, she turned her head held high and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind not just the table, but the weight of the moment. Her steps were measured, steady, each one a testament to the strength she would cultivated over the years, for despite the sting of rejection, Mrs. Lillian knew one thing: her spirit was unbreakable. For a moment, Mrs. Lillian considered turning and walking out. She was tired. Tired of the endless battle to prove her worth, tired of standing tall in the face of old prejudices that never seemed to fade. But as she looked at the young waiter's smirk, something inside her stirred, a fire she thought had dimmed over the years, but that had never truly gone out. No matter how many times she had been tested, her resilience remained. She was not just a customer here. She was Mrs. Lillian, and this young man, with all his arrogance and ignorance, had no idea who he was speaking to. Yet she would not reveal her connection to the restaurant's owner, at least not yet. She wanted to see just how far he would take this disrespect. This restaurant, her safe space for so many years, felt foreign and hostile now, but she would not let his rude attitude chase her away. She had every right to be here. She had earned it, and she was not about to let anyone strip that from her with a few careless words. The waiter, sensing her hesitation, leaned forward slightly, his smirk widening. "Do you really think you belong here?" He sneered, his gaze drifting disdainfully over her worn coat and practical shoes. "This is not your kind of place anymore." A mixture of anger, hurt, and defiance swirled within her, but Mrs. Lillian remained composed, her voice steady and unwavering. "I would like to speak to the manager," she said firmly yet softly. The waiter's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing in defiance. She repeated her request, hoping this was merely a misunderstanding, a simple case of poor manners. Despite the blatant signals, she still wanted to believe. People deserve the benefit of the doubt. But today, that belief was beginning to feel like a challenge, something fragile and delicate. She struggled to hold on to. Instead of acknowledging his error, the young man's demeanor grew colder, a hint of a sneer curving his lips. "I have already told you," he said, his tone hardening with irritation. "There are no tables available." Mrs. Lillian kept her composure, refusing to rise to his hostility. "I confirmed my reservation yesterday," she replied calmly. "Please, would you check again?" Her words were firm, but beneath them lay a quiet strength. She knew she was in the right. This was not about a simple mix-up. It was about something more insidious, something dark that lurked beneath the surface. It was becoming impossible to ignore. With a dramatic sigh, the waiter looked at her, as though her request were an unbearable inconvenience. He did not even glance at the reservation list. Instead, he leaned forward, lowering his voice, as if he were confiding something personal. "You do not belong here," he muttered, his words dripping with condescension. "There are plenty of other places for someone like you." There it was. The unspoken judgment she would sensed since she walked in now lay bare. It was not about the reservation or whether a table was truly available. It was about her, about who she was, how she looked, what he assumed she represented. To him, she was someone lesser, someone unworthy of the space she had every right to occupy. Mrs. Lillian stood there, the weight of his words pressing down on her. The memories flooded back, not because she was weak, but because she would lived this moment before. Countless times. She recalled being a young girl, walking into shops with her mother, only to be followed by suspicious eyes. She remembered the humiliation of being told certain spaces were not for her, of being denied opportunities because of assumptions others had made about her. Later, as a young woman, she faced the same kind of judgment in the workplace, where her skills were overlooked, her potential questioned, all because of what others saw when they looked at her. These were more than memories. They were scars, small but indelible. hidden beneath her quiet strength but never truly faded, each one a reminder of the barriers she would had to overcome. The waiter's voice cut through her thoughts, sharper and louder, pulling her back to the present. "Why do not you just leave?" he demanded, his voice rising so others could hear. "You are wasting everyone's time." Mrs. Lillian looked around, aware of the curious eyes fixed on her, the quiet, uncomfortable stares. Some patrons quickly glanced away when she met their gaze, but others continued to watch, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease, as if waiting for her to break, to leave quietly. She took a deep breath, steadying herself against the memories and emotions clawing their way to the surface. She had spent a lifetime pretending these moments did not hurt, brushing them off like dust. But each incident left a mark, each judgment another scar layered onto her spirit. But she would not crumble. With every stare, every moment of silent dismissal, she grew more certain that she had no intention of leaving. This was her space too, and she would not be forced out by the small mindedness of one disrespectful waiter. She belonged here, she had always belonged here. Regardless of how anyone else perceived her, once again she spoke, her voice unshaken. "I would still like to speak to the manager." The young man's face hardened further, clearly annoyed that she refused to be dismissed. His smirk faded, replaced by a look of irritation, as he realized she would not give up easily. But Mrs. Lillian knew she had something far more valuable than his fleeting approval. She had her pride, her sense of self, and the knowledge that she was unbreakable. The battle was far from over, but she would face it with the quiet strength that had carried her through a lifetime of challenges. She had spent years building her resilience, and today, that resilience would carry her through this moment too. The humiliation was familiar, this feeling of isolation, the sense that no one would stand by her, that she was alone once again, just as she had been so many times before. But Mrs. Lillian was no longer that young, uncertain girl who would walk away in silence. Years of enduring moments like this had taught her to stand firm, even when leaving would be easier. Her experiences had forged a quiet strength in her, a resilience that could not be taken by a few hateful words. She had fought too hard and come too far to let this disrespectful waiter or anyone else make her feel small. The room seemed to close in around her, but Mrs. Lillian held her ground. Her posture was straight, her hands steady, her resolve unwavering. She would not let him push her out. "Not like this, you do not need to raise your voice," she said softly but firmly, keeping her tone even. "I am not asking for anything unreasonable, just the table I reserved." Her calmness only seemed to rile the waiter further. He stepped back, crossing his arms with a smirk that made it clear he had no intention of helping her. "I already told you," he sneered. "You are not getting a table here, and frankly I do not care who you think you are." The silence that followed was thick with tension as Mrs. Lillian absorbed the full impact of his words. It was not only what he said, but the message beneath it that stung. He did not see her as a customer, as a person with dignity to him. She was an inconvenience, someone he could dismiss, someone who needed to be reminded of her place, and the place he saw for her was far beneath the space she stood in now. She thought about leaving, about all the time she would take in the high road, choosing silence over confrontation, letting the small slights slide by without comment. But not today, not here. Not in a place that was supposed to be her refuge, her familiar corner of warmth and welcome. Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Lillian spoke, with a calm that masked her frustration. "I do not think you realize who you are speaking to," she said softly, her voice steady and firm. She was not going to explain herself, not yet, but her words held a power she hoped might make him pause even for just a moment. But the waiter did not flinch. Instead he let out a short, mocking laugh, shaking his head, as though the idea that she could matter, that she could be important, was absurd. "It does not matter who you are," he replied, his tone dripping with arrogance. "You are not welcome here." The finality of his words hung in the air, like a guillotine. There was no pretense, no room for misunderstanding. His prejudice, his contempt was laid bare for everyone to see, and he showed no shame. He stood there, arms crossed, as if daring her to challenge him to make a scene. Mrs. Lillian felt a pang of frustration, a deep simmering anger that had always existed beneath layers of grace and civility. But instead of letting it boil over, she allowed it to transform into something stronger. Resolve. She would not let this man reduce her to the stereotype he seemed to expect. She would not become the angry, emotional woman he likely hoped to provoke. Instead, she would remain composed, meeting his hostility with dignity. She did not need to raise her voice, and she certainly did not need to prove anything to him. But she was not leaving, not until it was clear to him, and to everyone watching, that she had every right to be here. Not because of who her family was, or any connections she had, but because of who she was. Locking eyes with the waiter, Mrs. Lillian said, "I will wait for the manager." For a brief moment, the smirk slipped from the waiter's face, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features, but the hesitation was fleeting. He turned sharply on his heel, muttering something under his breath as he walked away, leaving her standing at the counter alone but unbowed. The other patrons continued to watch, their murmurs growing louder. Mrs. Lillian knew they were whispering about her, perhaps even wondering if she would relent, if she would finally give up and leave. But she did not move. She had learned long ago that sometimes, in the face of injustice, the most powerful response was simply to stand your ground quietly, with dignity. After a few moments, the waiter returned with a smug look, clearly unbothered by her request for a manager. He likely assumed it would be another quick dismissal, another case that could be easily brushed off with a few perfunctory words from someone in charge. Mrs. Lillian waited, her heart steady, her resolve solidified. She was not going to let this moment pass as just another instance of quiet indignity. After a few tense minutes, the manager finally approached, his expression hurried and slightly irritated as he looked around, scanning the room. His initial indifference showed. He seemed to be preparing for a minor disruption, just another customer complaint to resolve swiftly. But when he finally saw Mrs. Lillian's face, his demeanor shifted abruptly. Recognition dawned in his eyes, and with it a flash of unease. She was not merely an upset diner. She was the mother of the restaurant's owner. This was no ordinary customer dissatisfaction. It was a matter that carried a deeper significance. Her presence here held weight, not only because of her connection to the establishment, but because of who she was and what she represented. This was not a simple complaint. It was a matter of principle, one that could escalate beyond the confines of this room. "Mrs. Lillian," he greeted, his voice laced with a newfound apprehension. The casual approach he had intended faltered as he shot a nervous glance at the waiter, who stood stiffly behind the counter, still unaware of the depth of his mistake. "I am terribly sorry about the mix-up. Let me get you a table right away." Mrs. Lillian met the manager's gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. His attempt at a resolution was hasty, a quick fix to make the problem disappear, without addressing its root cause. She had seen this countless times before, the rushed apology, the shallow solution, meant to hush things up rather than actually resolve them. But she was not here for a superficial apology. She knew the damage was already done, and she was not willing to let it slide unanswered. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady, "but I think there is more we need to address before we talk about seating." The manager's face tightened, realizing this was not going to be as simple as he would hoped. He could feel the eyes of the other diners on him now, the hum of quiet conversations rising around them. His gaze shifted uneasily across the room, aware that the longer this went on, the more attention it would attract. This was not only about appearances anymore, it was about the uncomfortable position he now found himself in, caught between his responsibilities to uphold the restaurant's reputation, Mrs. Lillian's justified anger, and the increasing curiosity of the onlookers. "I understand," he said, his tone shifting to a forced politeness. "This was a misunderstanding. I am sure we value all our customers here." Mrs. Lillian raised an eyebrow slightly, sensing the insincerity in his words. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, her voice soft but unwavering. No, I do not think this was a simple misunderstanding. What happened here today was not just about a table or a reservation, it was about respect. Or more accurately, the lack of it. The manager visibly stiffened, glancing over at the waiter, who was now beginning to understand the gravity of what he had done. The young man shifted uncomfortably, his previous arrogance visibly replaced by a growing unease. He avoided meeting Mrs. Lillian's eyes, the smirk now gone replaced with uncertainty. "You are absolutely right, Mrs. Lillian," the manager responded quickly, desperate to salvage the situation. "And I assure you we will address this appropriately. Please allow me to seat you." But Mrs. Lillian was not ready to let the moment pass. "This is not just about seating me," she continued, her voice calm but filled with a quiet authority. "It is about ensuring this does not happen again, not just to me, but to anyone who walks through these doors." She could see the manager's discomfort deepen, the realization setting in that this would not end with a simple apology or a quick seating arrangement. This was becoming something bigger. A statement about how this establishment treated its patrons, and by extension, how it viewed people like her around them. The quiet murmur of the restaurant grew louder, the tension thickening as diners watched intently. Some patrons began lifting their phones, that discreetly, aiming their screens toward the interaction. Mrs. Lillian noticed but did not flinch. This was not the first time she would been the center of attention in a moment like this, and she doubted it would be the last. Standing tall, she met the manager's gaze once more, her expression resolute. This was a moment that required strength, a stand that extended beyond her own experience, and as she held her ground, Mrs. Lillian hoped that those watching, those who had seen what had transpired, would understand her message. Dignity was not something to be granted by others. It was something you carried, a right that no one could take away with a few dismissive words. This would not be the first time Mrs. Lillian had experienced such a scene, and she knew it likely would not be the last. She was not interested in making a spectacle, but if attention was on her, she would not shy away either. The manager, feeling the tension rising among the onlookers, tried to take control of the situation. "We take these matters very seriously," he announced, his voice louder, as if addressing the other patrons as much as Mrs. Lillian. "This behavior does not represent our values, and I assure you it will be dealt with immediately." The words hung in the air, but Mrs. Lillian could see through them. It was a familiar line, one she had heard countless times before, promises of change, assurances that this type of treatment would not be tolerated, only for nothing to truly shift. She was not here for empty promises. "I appreciate that," she replied, her voice calm but firm, "but I am not looking for a quick fix. I am looking for accountability. I am looking for more than just an apology or a table." The manager started to respond, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He understood she was right. There was no easy way out, no quick solution that would allow them all to go back to normal. With the eyes of the other diners watching, and cameras capturing the moment, the stakes had escalated. Mrs. Lillian's presence commanded attention, not through volume or aggression, but through quiet dignity. She did not have to raise her voice or make a scene. Her calm, composed stance lent weight to her words that even the loudest outcry could not match. The manager shifted uncomfortably, fully aware of the delicate, very public situation he now faced. He realized that he had to act decisively and sincerely. "I am truly sorry, Mrs. Lillian," he said again, this time with a hint of genuine remorse in his voice. His earlier mask of professionalism cracked, revealing someone who now understood the gravity of the moment. "I will speak directly with the owner about this, and we will ensure this is handled properly. Please believe me when I say that." Mrs. Lillian held his gaze unwavering. "I will hold you to that," she replied simply. She knew her son, Marcus, would hear about this soon enough, but for now she wanted to see it addressed from within, by the people who ran the restaurant on a daily basis. By now, the atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted entirely. What had begun as a quiet, barely noticed exchange was now the center of attention. Patrons whispered among themselves, some shocked, others nodding quietly in agreement with Mrs. Lillian's words. The story had already begun to spread beyond the walls of the restaurant, shared by those recording the encounter, their posts gaining traction on social media. Even as the conversation continued, the manager glanced around, sensing the growing pressure. This was no longer about appeasing a single customer, it was about the reputation of the entire establishment. He straightened his shoulders, his face turning serious, his expression more thoughtful. "I will handle this personally," he promised in a quieter tone, attempting to salvage a bit of privacy in the midst of the public spectacle. "I will speak with the staff, and we will make sure this never happens again." Mrs. Lillian gave him a small nod, acknowledging his promise, but knowing that it would take more than just conversations to fix the deeper issues at play. She was not here to seek revenge or make a scene for its own sake. She was here to take a stand for herself, and for anyone else who might face such treatment. "I will be watching," she said softly, her words carrying a weight that required no emphasis. The manager nodded solemnly, fully grasping the gravity of her statement. That afternoon Marcus scrolled through his phone, unwinding from a busy day, when a video in his feed caught his eye and froze him in his tracks. It was a clip posted by someone who had been dining at his restaurant, with a caption that set his heart racing. "Waiter humiliates elderly woman at local restaurant." Shameful, his pulse quickened as he clicked play, and within seconds he recognized his own restaurant, his own customers, his own staff. But what made his stomach drop was the sight of the woman at the center of it all, his mother, Mrs. Lillian. There she stood, composed and dignified, facing down a young waiter who radiated a smugness that twisted Marcus's insides. He watched as his mother calmly held her ground, not backing down, even as the manager tried to hastily smooth things over. Each part of the scene, the waiter's disrespect, the manager's initial reluctance, his mother's unwavering strength, hit Marcus like a blow. This was not just an upset customer. This was his mother, being mistreated in the very establishment he owned, the place he had strived to make a welcoming, inclusive space. Marcus felt his heart sink as he watched the video, a video of his own mother being disrespected, in the very restaurant she had helped him build. This place was not just a business to him, it was meant to be a sanctuary, a space filled with warmth and welcome. A place where anyone could walk in and feel at home, and yet here it was a setting for humiliation. And with his mother as the victim, fury ignited within him, a deep anger he had not felt in years. Without a second thought he grabbed his keys and headed straight to the restaurant. The drive was a blur as his mind raced, replaying what he had just seen. He cycled through emotions: disbelief, anger, shame. How could this happen? How had his staff allowed this? In a place he had worked so hard to make inclusive and kind. One thing was clear: he was not going to let this go unanswered. As Marcus pushed through the restaurant's door, the usual hum of conversations quieted. Heads turned and whispers rippled through the room. As people recognized him, eyes flickered between him and his mother, who stood near the counter, calm yet resolute, while the manager and waiter hovered a few feet away, oblivious to the storm about to descend on them. The waiter was the first to notice Marcus, and as realization dawned, the color drained from his face. Marcus was not just any customer, he was the owner, the son of the woman the waiter had just treated with disdain. The arrogance that had marked the waiter's demeanor moments before vanished, replaced by a look of dread. Marcus said nothing as he approached, his eyes fixed on the manager and the waiter, his jaw clenched tight. He could feel every patron's gaze on him, but his focus was singular. His mind held one purpose: to correct this injustice right here. Right now. The manager, visibly flustered, tried to speak, but Marcus cut him off with a sharp, controlled tone. "What happened here?" His voice was calm, but his anger simmered just beneath the surface, a calm before the storm. His words sliced through the tension like a knife. The manager stammered, his words faltering in an attempt at an explanation. But Marcus was not interested in excuses. His gaze moved to the waiter, who now looked as though he wished he could melt into the floor. "I am asking you," Marcus said, his tone steady and laced with barely contained fury. "Why was my mother treated this way in her own son's restaurant?" A heavy silence filled the room. The waiter, pale and visibly shaken, opened his mouth but no words came. His earlier smugness had crumbled, replaced by the realization of what he would done and the consequences he now faced. He understood too late the depth of his mistake, but there was no way out without waiting for a response. Marcus turned fully to the waiter, his voice firm and unwavering. "You are fired," he said, loud enough for every person in the restaurant to hear. The weight of those words hung in the air, final and unrelenting. "Get out of my restaurant." For a moment, disbelief flickered across the waiter's face. He seemed like he might argue, but a glance at Marcus's eyes silenced him. There was no room for negotiation, no second chances. With his head hung low, he gathered his things and slowly made his way out, his footsteps heavy with the weight of the opportunity he would just thrown away. Detention remained thick as Marcus turned his gaze to the manager, who stood frozen, still reeling from the intensity of the scene. "And you," Marcus said, his tone slightly softer, yet still charged with authority. "I trusted you to run this place in my absence. I trusted you to make sure that everyone who walks through these doors is treated with respect." His voice hardened. "That has not happened today." The manager swallowed, his face pale, nodding quickly as he stammered, "I am so sorry, Marcus. It was a mistake." "It was not just a mistake," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. "It was not just a mistake," Marcus continued, his voice cold but resolute. "It was a failure to uphold the very values this place stands for. I built this restaurant to be a place where everyone, no matter who they are, feels welcome. Today, my own mother was treated as though she did not belong, and that is unacceptable." The room was silent, every eye on Marcus as he spoke. His words were not just directed at the manager or the staff, they were for everyone present, and everyone who would hear about this moment later. This was not just a personal issue anymore. It was about justice, about making it clear what the restaurant truly stood for. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then turned to face the diners. He raised his voice, making sure every person in the room could hear. "What happened today was wrong," he said, his tone unwavering. "No one, whether they are regular or stepping in for the first time, should ever be made to feel like they do not belong, not here and not anywhere." His words were met with murmurs of agreement and nods from the patrons who had been watching the scene unfold. Some diners had already posted videos online, and the story was gaining traction on social media. Marcus knew that this was no longer just about his restaurant. It was becoming a statement about the kind of world they all wanted to live in. "I want to apologize not only to my mother, but to everyone who witnessed what happened today," he continued, his voice sincere. "This is not the kind of place we run, and I promise you we will make changes to ensure that something like this never happens again." A ripple of applause slowly spread through the room. It was not loud, but it was genuine. A recognition of the importance of standing up against injustice in a real, tangible way. As the applause faded, Marcus turned to his mother, who had remained quiet throughout the confrontation, her pride in her son evident on her face. He walked over to her, his anger softening, as he looked at the woman who had taught him everything he valued. "I am sorry, Mom," he said quietly, his voice full of regret. Mrs. Lillian gave him a small, knowing smile. "You did the right thing," she replied gently. "That is all that matters." Together they stood in the center of the restaurant, a quiet symbol of resilience and justice, not just for themselves but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they'd not belong. The struggle was not over, but today they had taken a stand. The story spread faster than Marcus could have imagined. Within hours, videos of the confrontation filled social media, gathering thousands of comments, likes and shares. People from all walks of life weighed in, some expressing outrage at the discrimination Mrs. Lillian had faced, others applauding Marcus for his swift decisive action. Soon news outlets picked up the story, framing it not as a scandal, but as a powerful moment of justice being served in real time. The headlines focused not on the humiliation, but on how quickly and firmly Marcus had delivered. Justice. Marcus had anticipated some backlash when he fired the waiter on the spot, but what he had not expected was the overwhelming flood of support. Community leaders, activists, and customers reached out, praising how he would handle the situation with both integrity and strength. The support was not just about the decision to fire the waiter, it was a recognition of Marcus's public stance against discrimination in a place that had long prided itself on inclusivity. The power of social media had transformed a painful moment into something much larger. The videos did not just capture the confrontation, they highlighted Marcus's promise to the patrons, the pledge to ensure such incidents would never happen again. It was this vow that resonated with people across the community and beyond. Marcus understood that his restaurant had always been more than just a place to eat. It was a reflection of the values he and his family held dear. Now, with the world watching, he realized the responsibility that came with that. In the days that followed, Marcus wasted no time in turning his words into action. He announced a series of new initiatives. Marcus launched a series of new initiatives, starting with mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for his entire staff. This training was not just a response to what had happened, it was a proactive step to prevent anything like it from happening again. Marcus understood that this incident could have easily tarnished his restaurant's reputation. Instead, he chose to turn it into an opportunity for growth, a chance to set a higher standard. He wanted his restaurant to be a model for what could happen when a business took genuine responsibility for its actions and used its platform for positive change. In addition to the training, he reached out to local community leaders, inviting organizations to work with him on making the restaurant a permanently safe, inclusive space. This was not going to be a one-time effort. He intended for it to become a core part of the restaurant's identity. The community's response was immediate and heartfelt. Leaders from various groups offered their support, their ideas, and their commitment to help make this more than just a lesson learned. It became a movement toward lasting change. For Mrs. Lillian, the days following the incident were quieter, but no less meaningful. She had always carried herself with grace in the face of adversity, but this time felt different. This was not another instance of discrimination she had to quietly accept. Her son had stood up not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. It was a quiet triumph, not because the waiter had been fired, but because justice for once had been swift and public. As she reflected on her journey, she could not help but remember the countless times she would face exclusion, the many doors that had closed because of who she was. Those experiences had shaped her, strengthened her, but they had also worn her down in ways she did not always allow herself to acknowledge now. At what could have been just another painful memory, she felt something different, pride not just for her son, but for how far they both had come. Mrs. Lillian knew better than anyone that the fight against injustice was ongoing. It was a struggle, fought in small moments and in grand displays, in whispers and in shouts. But this moment felt like a true victory. It was proof that change could happen, that standing up for respect and dignity could lead to something better. She had always believed in resilience, in the quiet strength of perseverance, and now more than ever she saw the power of that belief. The community's response was overwhelming. Patrons who had witnessed the incident firsthand returned to the restaurant in even greater numbers, not out of curiosity but out of genuine support. For Marcus and Mrs. Lillian, they had witnessed something rare, a demand for justice, delivered without hesitation or compromise. It was a reminder that the fight against discrimination was not just an abstract issue. It was real, happening in everyday places, even in establishments that prided themselves on inclusivity. The restaurant itself became a symbol of resilience and progress. not because it had avoided scandal, but because it had confronted it head-on. Messages of support poured in. Some people shared their own stories of facing prejudice, thanking Marcus for taking a stand. Others, who had never experienced such treatment but understood its significance, showed their solidarity, expressing their own commitment to fighting discrimination. The restaurant's social media pages were flooded with comments. Many came from people who had never visited before, now promising to stop by if they were ever in town. The support was not just local, it was global. A testament to how universal these issues were, and how much people were paying attention. As days turned into weeks, Marcus kept his promises. The new initiatives rolled out smoothly, and the restaurant began to feel like a place of healing. Rather than hurt, the staff embraced the changes, understanding that this was not merely about appeasing customers. It was about creating a space where everyone felt safe, respected, and valued. Sensitivity training was just the beginning. Marcus knew there was still a long journey ahead, but for the first time in a while, he felt hopeful, not only for his restaurant, but for the larger community it served. Mrs. Lillian watched all of this unfold with quiet pride. She had always believed her son was capable of great things, but witnessing him transform a painful experience into something meaningful filled her with a satisfaction words could not capture. She knew challenges would continue to arise, but today, in this moment, she allowed herself to savor the victory they would earn together. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Lillian paused at the door, taking in the familiar sights, sounds, and aromas of the place she would long cherished. It felt different now, in the best way possible. This restaurant was no longer just a place to eat. It was a symbol of resilience, justice, and dignity, and as she stepped outside, Mrs. Lillian was not simply a mother or a customer. She was a testament to quiet strength, to standing up in the face of injustice, and to the power of holding one's ground.